Welcome to the Procurement Software Podcast, where we aim to educate and inspire you about how technology is changing and shaping our profession. The truth is, there's never been a more exciting time to be in procurement, but only if you're one of those organizations that's embracing the change and driving new developments. And this podcast is all about giving you the tools to help you get there. So buckle up and let's get right into this week's show. Yes, a very warm welcome to another episode of the Procurement Software Podcast. We are the only podcast out there focused specifically on procurement software. And I've actually got a bit of a pleasurable episode to record today because it's one of the rare instances that we get to do a podcast episode in person. And I'm talking today to one of the co-founders of Cotiss, who I was at the Wolfpack Summit in New York City with over the last 2 days when we're recording this. So I'd like to welcome Harry Wilde to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
And we're both a little bit jet lagged because we're both in the US on very little sleep, but the show must go on. It was too good an opportunity to pass up that we're both going to be in town at the same time. So, Harry, just give a quick introduction to yourself and to Cotiss before we dive in, then we can go from there.
Yeah, so I'm Harry. I'm one of the co-founders here at Cotiss. Essentially what we do is we build really beautiful, really easy to use source to contract software for the world's regulated industries. So we do a lot of work in government, things like data centers, infrastructure, utilities, regulated banking, helping people with those big, gnarly RFPs and helping with vendor performance.
And how is that different then to sourcing requirements from more generic industry sectors? Let's say just more generic manufacturing services tech. What are the typical watch outs then that you think that sector specifically needs to look out for when they're sourcing piece of e-sourcing software or source to contract platform?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, James. So I think the thing that we tend to see from our customers is a fair level of non-priced requirements and complex non-priced requirements. If you're thinking about, a manufacturing organization sourcing, say, tons of aluminium or, hundreds of SKUs, really it ends up a lot about price heat mapping, understanding the price of specific vendors and then kind of negotiating on those price. For us, when we're working, it's often big services projects, big IT implementations. But then we also do, a fair amount of more direct spend, but then with big non-price component as well. So it might be fibre optic cabling. It might be parts for offshore wind farms, things like that.
So bearing that in mind then, would I be right in thinking that just from a pure product perspective, the way that you've designed and engineered Cotiss as a product needs to factor in more of the requirements that you would need to do sort of further upstream on the front end in relation to some of the more point and play, 3 bids and a buy type of software that you see out there?
Yeah, absolutely. We tend to see our sweet spot is sort of 2 types of people for it when it comes to sourcing. Generally people who are running big, gnarly RFPs or people who are running RFPs and then a fair amount of RFQs. The space that we generally don't begin to play in too much is, direct manufacturing or software and services organizations running lots and lots of RFQs. I think you then begin to, stray into more manufacturing procurement or you begin to get into construction tools like Procore.
Okay. So you use the word big, gnarly RFP, which I love. I'm going to use that one day. Give me an example of something like that just to contextualize it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, we've had some absolutely fascinating ones run through our platform. We've actually got someone procuring hovercrafts at the moment. Stands out to me as sort of one of the most bizarre ones. It's an airport that we work with. And then apart from that, I think that, it tends to be like a big HRS system on the software side, a really substantial services panel, or just lots of, say, solar panels for a solar farm or kind of large main contractor construction procurement. So not actually doing the construction themselves, but procuring, paying a main contractor hundreds of millions of dollars or $50 million, something like that. to build, energy plants or to build out cell tower infrastructure or do fibre optic.
So basically big, complex stuff that has a lot of compliance and a lot of regulation on the front end that needs to be considered. Before you even maybe take suppliers in to bid, you're going to have to review those documents and do due diligence on the vendors before you take them forward into either a sourcing or a way you probably wouldn't even do an auction exercise, would you? In that sense, it would be more of a structured RFP.
Yeah, absolutely. So what it's functionally meant is we've spent a lot of time building out our evaluation tool specifically, really built out to be incredibly easy for panel members to do non-price evaluation, but also really easy to do price evaluation is something we're building out more. That said, we are supporting, lots of RFQ stuff now as well, but we really did start in that sort of big, gnarly RFPs as the terminology I think we're going to start using today.
Just written your marketing tagline for me.
Yeah, exactly. But we definitely do support RFQs as well. We're aware that not everyone is just doing $10 million of RFPs. There are a number of our customers who are also doing a fair amount of maybe 3 bids or just more RFQ, low-level RFP style, but still being sort of fairly regulated, fairly compliant organizations. Yeah, and less shooting from the hip.
Got it. I wanted to dwell on that a little bit because there are a lot of sourcing tools already out there. And I think it's key, especially for the listener, just to understand. And often there's a lot of confusion out there. If you see 10 different tools all saying that they do source to contract, it's how do you differentiate between them? So especially in light of the fact that you're not focusing on large enterprises and you're typically going into organizations that would have smaller procurement teams, I think it's important to make that differentiation. So if you're talking to a customer, whether they've come as an inbound or whether you've gone outbound and you're having that conversation as a first discussion point, where do you typically find they're at in terms of the technology or the processes that they're using as the existing situation?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of use cases that we find. So I think the first one we find is we are running everything on Excel email. Tends to be a pretty common one. But I suppose the step up from that is we have a point solution that does our sourcing. And it's, literally just a non-priced kind of upload, download box, but they've kind of moved past email. We then tend to see insert really clunky, old school mid-market system that hasn't been updated in 15 years. Or we find people who have, and I will say SAP is terrible for this, have SAP as an ERP and then have been given, a Ariba as part of that deal, and it's just functionally unusable for them.
The poison chalice of the SAP salesman that gives them Ariba as a gift. And
and they've spent, that $100,000 implementing it and have just kind of gone, look, this is just not working for our 4 or 5 person procurement team. And it's actually not worth keeping up. And actually, we just need a sourcing tool or a sourcing and contract tool. Is kind of, I think those are the sort of use cases that we tend to see.
And I think that's very fair. I mean, I'm sometimes a little bit harsh on Ariba myself. I think it's pretty common knowledge that I'm not a fan of it, but I do see where it has its place. But it's always going to be in large enterprise procurement teams that have center of excellence and have that resource to be able to train users to get the most out of it. It can do a lot. It's just a bit clunky on the front end, and it's hard for users to be able to get to grips with if they're not super users or are not experienced in the platform. So I think that is a key differentiator, the fact that you're typically going into procurement teams that are 10 or less typically in size, and something like that that's aimed at essentially Fortune 500 companies is, you're right, it's not fit for function.
Yeah, the procurement team size thing's interesting. From a marketing perspective, we talk about it as small and medium procurement teams. Functionally, what we actually mean is you kind of have a trade-off, right, when you're buying any sort of software, which is you can either get something that's easier to implement and easier to use, but that's going to mean that it's less customizable. There's going to be some bits of the process you just can't change. That's us. In the marketing space, we sit close to the HubSpot, for example. Then you have tools that the world's your oyster. Salesforce is an example of this. Coupa's an example of this. SAP Ariba is an example of this. However, it's going to take you 12 to 18 months to implement. So when we go into organizations, what we're actually saying to them is, look, we've built variants in the tool. So for example, in rating scales and evaluation and what custom fields you can record and how the approvals workflows, there are some bits that you just cannot change as they're baked into the product. The trade-off is that we can be up and running in a couple of weeks for contracts or, evaluation and sourcing. We can be running up functionally in a day, but you may need to tweak your process slightly to fit our tool. That is a lot easier to do in a team of 10. Very fair enough. In a team of 50 or a team of 60 procurement people, that is nigh on impossible to do across an organization. So I think that they're better off going for, the large enterprise players or people who can come in and do a deeply custom implementation.
And you hit the nail on the head with any product that's aimed at a mid-market sort of business. You're not going to be able to be everything to everyone. And if you're a company that's purchasing a lot of SaaS, then Cotiss probably isn't the right solution for you. But other companies that are fit very, very much into your box that, as you say, it's a pretty underserved market. And when we were doing a bit of competitor analysis, looking at who else is out, sort of preparing, there are a couple that touch on that, but there aren't many. So I definitely think you're onto something. You're originally from New Zealand, and obviously that's quite a small market, relatively speaking, albeit it's a very developed economy. Talk me through your story a little bit, because we're here in New York recording this. The US is a market that you're just in the process of your go-to-market strategy and entering the US market. So talk to me a little bit about your journey and how you got to this point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I will say I'm one of 3 co-founders. This isn't just my journey, and we're surrounded by a really fantastic team. But really the genesis of Cotiss was I was working in advertising. I originally wanted to be a diplomat, but then I did an internship at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Absolutely hated it. So I decided to go into advertising. And I was often the person as a strategist that would write and respond to RFPs and often would negotiate with procurement teams. So I was kind of always fascinated by procurement teams and had spent quite a lot of time with them. COVID hit. I'm back in New Zealand for a friend's wedding. I can't leave the country because the border's shut down. My agency makes 50% of its staff globally redundant. And I end up going from being this quite well-paid ad strategist, helping lead digital for Daimler in Asia Pacific, to being unemployed on my mum's couch in the middle of lockdown. So I do a real sort of re-look at where I'm at in life and think about the problems that I can solve. And, I kept coming back to, at the time there was all this government spend going out through RFPs. So I contacted these businesses and was kind of helping them write RFPs to respond to stuff. Through this, I began to spend more and more time with procurement teams, and I also began to spend more and more time with my 2 co-founders, one of whom, who are funnily enough, both called Matt, one of whom was an engineer at Atlassian, which has Jira as a product. It's one of the world's largest workflow companies. And my other co-founder was the head of FP&A for a large software company, and procurement reported into him. And he had a fairly small procurement team. So we were kind of getting together, sort of talking about the word procurement and what we were saying. And that was really the genesis of Cotiss, of saying how undertooled small and medium procurement teams in our local market were. Look, a little bit of less of a sector focus at that point, but really, seeing that these teams were so often operating with just Excel and email. And then it kind of evolved into, okay, cool. Well, actually, what is the global opportunity here? We managed to recruit really well. Beginning of 2023, we raised a small pre-seed round, spent about a year building the product. And then 2024 kind of launched into market, grew fairly rapidly in ANZ. We're very thankful that some fairly large sort of regulated customers in ANZ decided to take a punt on us, including really big government agencies. And then began exploring the US and the UK. Just realized that, look, this is actually a market that's really underserved globally, not just in ANZ. So now I'm based in San Francisco, and we're here in New York.
So that's an interesting story. And actually, this podcast was a COVID lockdown project as well, funnily enough. We launched our first episode in, I think it was 27th of March, 2020. I'll have to check my back catalogue. So going from a relatively small market in New Zealand and Australia, where indeed, you're still active, you're still growing, the level of competition and the needs and the requirements and the demands in a market as fast-paced and as vast as the US market, everyone wants to play there because the domestic market's so big. What made you think that you would be able to succeed in that market given, that there's already a bunch of software out there that's serving, North American procurement teams? It's the obvious question to ask. I'm going to have to ask it anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. Look, I will say probably arrogance, partly, and a bit of self-belief. No, I think that procurement is a really weird category in that procurement gets used both as like a top-level category name and as a subcategory name. I actually think that procurement tech in general needs to do a better job of communicating that procurement tech is the same sort of category level as like marketing tech or sales tech. Because no one looks at sales tech and goes, oh, there's so many sales tech companies, there's no possible room for any more, right?
Yeah,
it's very obvious that Gong is very different from HubSpot. Whereas, even when we're raising our rounds, right? Or even talking to procurement people, and there's often this kind of misconception that like procurement is a busy category, but the people that are managing POs for retail are the same as people who are building intake and orchestration, who are the same people who are building, sourcing for manufacturing companies. Whereas actually like they service very, very different markets. And while the problems may be the same, sometimes the solution is incredibly different based on the type of business that you're serving. And our observation and I will say, partly thanks to James helping us with a little bit of competitor mapping, was that there were very few organizations that were servicing the markets that we wanted to service. And I think as we've expanded in the US, that has absolutely proven true. There are competitors, but yeah, we feel that we can outcompete them.
Yeah, no, I would tend to agree with that. I mean, I think it is a busy space, and I do said this publicly. I think there will be some consolidation, and indeed, we're seeing it now. Just last week, Searchuo was acquired by Cooper, albeit not in this source to contract space. But I also think that there's a lot of dead wood out there. And if new companies are coming in and disrupting and maybe usurping some of those legacy software platforms, for us as an industry and for us as procurement professionals, if the tech is evolving and getting better and disrupting more, ultimately, I see that's a good thing. And as long as the market continues to grow and doesn't start to contract, then I absolutely agree with you. And I think especially now with what's happening with tariffs and with supply chain uncertainty, there is more of a light being shone on procurement. And we are slowly but surely starting to get that attention from the board. And with that, one would hope would come some investment into our processes and tools and tech stack, because it's certainly long overdue in most companies. Like, as you quite rightly said, your biggest competitor in most cases is email and Excel.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so walk me through a little bit then. What do you think good should look like in the industry sectors that you're typically going into? We've already gone through what the current situation is often like in the industry sectors that you're going into, battling a lot against manual processes, spreadsheets, emails. If you walk through a sourcing event from end to end, could you maybe give me a synopsis of what you think a good process should look like, both from the process and what the tech can do to sort of help you along the way and to emulate that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think firstly, the job of good technology, especially in the procurement space, is easing procurement's profile within organizations. I often find that, and I'll focus in on evaluation, right? If you've never evaluated a procurement before, if you've never been involved in an RFP or an RFQ, getting sent a SharePoint file with a bunch of Excel spreadsheets and some instructions from a procurement team is probably not the best way to kick off. And I often think that that's, the lack of engagement that some procurement teams get, it is kind of based on that, right? So
yeah, I think that's fair. We've not endeared ourselves to the organizations historically with the processes dumped on them. Yeah, I think that's pretty fair.
Yeah. So I think any good sourcing event starts with business partnering, right? We don't do intake, we don't do orchestration, And that's primarily because, a lot of the organizations that we do, the RFPs and the RFQs that they're running are, usually a pretty core part of their business or government agency. There's already kind of a process set up to manage that, or it's project-based or things like that.
And I think also with intake, there are examples where this is not the case, but generally, if someone is looking to an intake, raising their hand saying, I want to buy something, it's usually, I may be generalizing a little bit here, but it tends to be something more tactical. If somebody wants to source something, typically in an organization, especially in a relatively small procurement organization, that person's going to know who the buyer is, right? It's only in a huge enterprise that might not be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, look, we work with, government agencies that are 2,000 people. We work with, sort of telecom communications companies that are private people, right? So there's a real, we're not massive, and we don't have massive 5,000, 10,000 person enterprise customers in the first place. But I think the first thing that we observe is proper procurement planning during a sourcing event. So what are you actually going to do? How are you going to evaluate this? Who's going to be involved? Are you going to run an RFI into an RFP? Are you going to run, a future procurement opportunity 2 years in advance? How are you actually going to do this? And then getting business alignment and approval around the procurement plan. So I think that's kind of the first step. And I actually think often structuring that properly leads to some really good outcomes. What I tend to see, and actually I tend to see this a little bit when people buying procurement software, which I always find a little bit frustrating. It's just launching directly into an RFP without really understanding the market super well. So we kind of get these RFPs and then we'll be reading and it's we want them to do really intense evaluation, but we also want them to manage POs and we also want them to manage intake. And then it's labeled source to contracts. And you're it's not actually a source to contract platform. You want you want to procure to pay. So I think running an RFI and going, okay, cool. We're looking to do this. Who can do what and not making it too large for the vendors? Or, if you know who you want to go straight to an RFP. But understanding that is actually how you're going to structure procurement and having to think about that is something that we, aim to get our customers to do. And then, I think obviously this is the sourcing event itself. It's, using technology to, help you write the sourcing, to write the documentation, help you manage the documentation, help you manage vendor responses. Mandatory questions is something that I see, I think is a bit strangely underused, which is just, do you need this ISO compliance? Do you need this SOC 2? Do you need this health insurance? And I think a lot of people do that at due diligence, but I think actually bringing that forward into the sourcing event is often incredibly helpful because it actually helps weed vendors out who might score really well, but actually cannot service you because of, their public liability insurance or something like that.
Wow. So a lot of on the front end, making sure that you've pre-qualified your vendor before you even take them into the RFP process. Okay. One of the things that are also quite commonplace within a lot of the older sourcing or source to contract products is, and it's always been a bit of a bugbear back in the day when I was running sourcing events, it's always been very, very difficult to do post-bid vendor analysis without just exporting all of the responses into an Excel spreadsheet and doing it in there. Increasingly now, with the ability of AI to be able to analyze and report on complex data in unstructured formats, that's becoming a game changer. Talk to me a little bit around, specifically because you were saying around regulated industries often being less focused on price-related factors. Talk to me a little bit about Cotiss's capabilities in terms of being able to analyze bids and responses beyond just who's got the best price or the shortest lead time.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I will say I'm really proud of our evaluation tool. And we have true enterprise customers who have SAP, who have Oracle, who just use our evaluation tool as a standalone. I think it's genuinely one of the strongest parts of our system, and we've spent a lot of time focusing on it. So really what we aim to do there is essentially allow you to link an evaluation event to a sourcing event, and then you can pull through supplier responses from a sourcing event. You can also manually upload responses if you're using a standalone or if you build an integration. I think an observation that I've made recently, and I've seen this a couple of times, is the criteria that you score for a non-priced evaluation being the exact same criteria that you have a vendor score. And it's to dive into that, right? So you have like 150 questions. And this to be clear, I think this is the wrong way to go about it. You have 150 questions that a vendor has to fill out, and they're, partially comply, not comply, right? Making those your criteria is so draining for the evaluation team. I actually think that, consolidating those for the evaluation team into a list of, they can look at what complies, what doesn't comply, and kind of score the vendor, use AI to pull out information around the bids, and kind of gain an understanding that way is what we tend to see better. I think then using a system where you can actually preview the documents, where you can preview the questionnaires fully within the system, you can kind of jump around, compare different scores, and you can actually score the criteria or abstain, all of that sort of stuff within the system works substantively better than just sending someone a giant Excel spreadsheet to evaluate. Yeah, honestly, like evaluation for us is one of the tools that we often go in with first. We're fully modular. And the reason we go in there first is if you're using Excel for evaluation for RFPs and RFQs, having a SaaS tool that's, not incredibly costly and is like essentially a rip and replace for your Excel process allows procurement to start delivering value within the business and actually helps build the case for more procure tech. Because the business goes, oh, that really agonizing part of the procurement process that I've had to engage in? Oh, well, actually now that's gone. Now this is like nice software that I get to use. It's really easy to use, all that sort of stuff. And then it's easier for procurement teams to then go, okay, well, there's these other things that we would like to bring in. Obviously, like the Cotiss proposition is we would love for those tools to be our tools. But I think it's true, we don't do spend analytics, for example. People often bring in spend analytics tools after us, that sort of thing. I think like having a point, a kind of wedge, you wedge in something and then making sure that goes well to follow with other procure tech is often the best outcome.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that you touched on there in terms of just being able to make it so much easier in terms of post-bid analysis, are you finding that just the reduction in end-to-end cycle time of a sourcing event is one of the things that gives the customers ROI? Because if it's typically a less price-related type of sourcing event, it's difficult to measure ROI on savings in this instance, right? Or it's more difficult than 3 bids and a buy type of organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, to be clear, we absolutely do RFQs and we definitely do the 3 bids and the buy and do, all the price analysis stuff. But I think that, especially for those bigger RFPs, where you can really kind of pull the lever on getting really good engagement from your panel and actually selecting the right vendor and look, maybe, bringing prices down or bringing service up, having really good evaluation panel engagement and actually selecting the right person is really important. And I think, but honestly, my concern with Excel spreadsheets is that, vendors are definitely using AI tools to write RFPs. I have a growing concern if you're using Excel for your evaluators are using AI to evaluate. And then that raises questions around how accurately you're actually selecting vendors and things like that.
So we touched a little bit on AI. As we look to close this out, I have to talk about AI a little bit because it's everywhere. The conference that we just spent 2 days in, it's like everything is talking about AI. Can you maybe share some tips or some potential slip-ups that procurement leaders need to be aware of when they're looking at e-sourcing tools and how they integrate AI and the relative usefulness of being able to leverage AI?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think the first, and I'm not even talking about procurement here, I'm talking about our business internally. I think AI can be really powerful, but it works a lot better if your data is clean, connected, and consistent. I think that just putting in, you get garbage in, garbage out, right? Like the models, functionally, really the models are only as good as the data that you train them on. And look, I think there's massive utility in building small tools or even just using ChatGPT and Claude in your day-to-day life to, you're going into a supplier meeting, give me information about the supplier or dropping in notes to then kind of structure it for suppliers, right? But to get real utility out of AI, for example, writing RFPs, if you wanted to write really, really good RFPs, that tool needs probably a really good library of RFPs from the vendor, but it also needs the kind of your RFPs that you've written historically that you're really, really proud of. If you just go to ChatGPT and go, can you give me an RFP for, we're using a microphone, let's say microphones, you're going to get a far worse outcome than if you feed it with good data. I think that's true across contracts. I think that's true across, sourcing events. I think that's true across every part of the journey. I think this, and again, this isn't true in procurement. This is kind of true across every software. I think people are being sold, functionally vaporware. They're being sold essentially AI hype. And this was honestly a theme that came up at the conference that we were just at, which is vendors coming going, we've put AI into our product, and people going, yeah, but the thing that you've built doesn't actually help me in any way. And they're like, well, we've got AI. And they're like, yeah, well, it's not a solution, it helps. So I think when we're going about building AI, and we think about it in the same way that we think about any technology, right? Which is, what is the customer problem, and what is the suite of solutions that we could use to solve this problem? My co-founder, Matt Whiting, who leads our product team, often talks about a solution in search of a problem. And I think I'm seeing that across procurement, I'm seeing that across finance, I think across HR, of people going, I need to have AI in my product, building it and it not actually servicing a problem. So that's something that we're definitely trying to stay away from.
Yes. I'm laughing because it's true that, you see it often and think, well, have your customers actually said that they want that? Yeah. Before we close out, just talk to me a little bit around implementation, because you mentioned earlier on when we were talking that it doesn't take 12 to 18 months to implement. So what are you typically seeing as implementation cycles?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to dive a bit more into the Cotiss product. So functionally what we do is we do sourcing, evaluation, contract management, and vendor performance. And we do that with people who are, doing RFPs or, doing a fair number of RFQs, right? And have kind of like complex vendor relationships they need to manage and perform. We don't really do true contract management. We do really a contract repository with approval workflows and sort of data that you can track against the contract as well as signing. We don't aim to be a true CLM. So really what we aim to do is have a system that can be configured at an administrative level. So for example, approvals workflows, what metadata you capture, what custom fields you capture, can be configured at an admin level. And what that means is that we can be up and delivering value in a matter of days as opposed to a matter of months. I will say, inevitably, the most difficult module to implement is always contract management or, contract management, I suppose, and performance, because depending on the quality of where people have their contracts, if they have that, sort of SharePoint, if it's in emails, if you have your contracts consolidated and structured well, it's quite easy for us to implement. But we're sort of a little bit hampered sometimes by the fact of we don't know how many contracts we have, 10 people have left. We need to go and find these contracts. But sourcing and evaluation, especially as sourcing, they're just really, really easy to implement. And they're really built to be, a couple of hours of training usually to make sure, including running test runs, just to make sure you've got the product right. And then, people are kind of up and running.
Yeah, and that's generally a theme for sourcing products versus P2P that requires ERP integration, or at least integration into an accounting system. It's inevitably going to be a longer implementation cycle for that. So I'm not surprised to hear that it's pretty fast. Okay, final quick fire round, Harry, before we close out. So the first one is, if you could live anywhere in the world, money was no object, where would it be?
Oh, honestly, New York. This is my first time being here, and it's amazing. I think I was saying this to one of our investors last night. I think my observation is probably that, I think New York is an amazing city to live, but I can see why San Francisco has far more sort of multi-billion-dollar tech companies. The city is far too exciting, I think, to be building a really successful software company. But yeah, I think my takeaway would be, from my observations so far, New York would be pretty high on that list.
Okay. And then the final one, and you've got to keep this clean. What's your favorite guilty pleasure?
Honestly, I have a massive sweet tooth. I love pastries and I love chocolate. And as I grow older, watching my weight and my waistline becomes an ongoing challenge.
I hear you there. I'm back into running regularly now after a few months of not. And yes, I need to. So Harry, if anyone would like to find out a little bit more about Cotiss, where's the best place we should send them?
Yeah, absolutely. You can head to cotiss.com, find a little bit about us there. Or honestly, feel free to add me on LinkedIn. I'm always super willing to chat and yeah, very open.
And I'll pop Harry's details in the show notes for anyone that wants to take him up on that offer. Harry, been a pleasure. Always good to catch up and great to meet you in person finally.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, James. Thanks for having me.
Okay, that was Harry, and that was Cotiss, source to contract for complex industries, sourcing big, complex stuff in a nutshell. Just a quick one before we sign off. If you would like to grab our tech maps to find out what is out there, apart from Cotiss in the source to contract space, then head across to store.procurementsoftware.site, where we've got tech maps for SME, mid-market, enterprise, as well as a bunch of different primary categories where you can compare and contrast all the different procurement tech solutions that are out there. We'll catch you again on the next one around about the same time next month. Until then, take care wherever you are. Thank you for listening and bye for now.